professional and personal experience of a lifetime through a number of different regimes. He was one of the people who helped put together the Constitution, which included quotas for women in positions of authority in Afghanistan, but her own personal stories of hearing about her brothers and her father who were assassinated by the jihadists, and her experience of growing up in a Soviet controlled country, and then the Taliban and the jihadists, and then the various aspects of the present situation that make her a fascinating opening speaker. I'm really delighted to have so many of you here. First of all, it's great to have old friends back, Mandy and Dave Grasso. Won't introduce. Maybe I'll introduce Dave, but he's our first Army fellow, and for some reason, this old warrior, this human rights guy, got along, and it's been a treat over the years to stay in touch. I'd like to welcome Sean and Chad, our colleagues from the U.S. Air Force Academy, professors down there, as we begin to develop a relationship that I think will be fruitful in the years to come between the Corbell School and the U.S. Air Force Academy. Very excited about where we go with that. I suppose I haven't introduced myself. My name is Claude Destray. I'm a member of the faculty here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. In addition to directing the Center on Rights Development, I direct the International Human Rights Degree Program and the Human Trafficking Center. The Center on Rights Development, or CORD as we call it, I should say next year, I can announce it here, next year we're going through a name change and rebranding. We're going to be the Center on Human Rights Education after 20 plus years of existence. So CORD, though, is the oldest center at the Corbell School. Our founding document, the document we use to get our ideas from, that we use is the ICESCR, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is one of the 3 documents that make up what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights, but probably the least known of those 3 documents. I think one of the things that makes CORD unique is that other than me, and they often dismiss me anyway, is that the staff is made up entirely of graduate students here, and that they work very hard all year working on a particular theme and then culminating in a subset of that theme for the spring symposium. So each year, CORD picks a different theme for the year, and that again becomes the focus here. In past years, we have done work on indigenous rights, the right to education, the right to emergency health care, and water rights, amongst others. And so we're here for, this is what I said, the 17th, and so this is actually a long-standing contribution that we've made, not just the Corbell community, but the greater community in Denver, and it's always a treat to be able to bring in both local, national, and international experts on, we try to pick actually topics that are not actually discussed very much, that are important, but we don't see getting a clearer picture. So I'm going to begin by introducing our opening speaker, who will sort of set the stage, and then after you're done, if our moderator isn't here, then I will continue in my role. So Maggie Jesme is the Thomas J. Watson Fellow, and she completed a research project titled Healing for Resistance, where she explored the uses of intra-community psychosocial support in strengthening the social movements. Along with learning from Tibetan, Rwandan, and South African activists, Maggie spent 4 months working alongside Syrian activists in Gaziantep. Did I pronounce that? Gaziantep, okay. Turkey, at the Center for Civil Society and Democracy in Syria. She previously worked with Syrians on 2 occasions in Jordan, when she completed a Mellon Foundation-funded public health research project and coordinated an entrepreneurial project with low-income Jordanian and Syrian women. So I'm going to turn that over now to you, Maggie, let you give your introductions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Fawn, and everyone else at the Center on Rights Development for putting together this panel and for providing the space for us to discuss such an important topic. Today I want to talk to you about the Syrian Revolution. While I think we hear about Syria in the news all the time, it usually we're hearing about ISIS and bombed out cities, and this doesn't do justice to the complexity of the revolution, war, and refugee crisis, nor to the courage and accomplishments of the Syrian people. Last year I had the opportunity to work alongside Syrian peace activists in Gaziantep, a city about an hour north of Syria in southern Turkey, and I was amazed by the courageous work that they do to build a peaceful, democratic future for Syria. About half the activists that I worked with are women, and while I wish that they were here today to share their stories, since they're not, I'm going to the best of my ability. I want to address first something that some people, probably not in this audience, but some people do wonder when I talk about female activists in the Middle East. They're like, what? That exists? I think our media portrays the Middle East in a way that causes many Americans to view it as an oppressive, even dangerous place for women. And I've had people question me why I, as a woman, like spending so much time there. But I think that while, yes, Syria has a pretty patriarchal society, Syrian men and women are fighting to change it just as we challenge patriarchy here. To ignore the influential role of women in the revolution would be almost impossible. They're not a side story in the revolution, and you don't have to search hard to dig up stories of women's involvement. They've been at the front and center of this revolution since the very beginning in 2011, leading the Syrian Revolution for Democracy and Freedom. They protested in the streets alongside men. They organized their own women-led protests. They've led local coordination committees that strategize what's happening next in the revolution. They've smuggled humanitarian aid and then even arms through checkpoints when the Syrian people took up arms to defend themselves against the regime. And in some cases, like in the case of my host sisters in Gaziantep, two young Syrian women in a relatively conservative Muslim family, they are the main breadwinners for their family and bring in the money to support their parents and brothers with their work in the humanitarian aid sector. So before I share some of their specific accomplishments and ideas, I want to start with a crash course in the Syrian Revolution, the shortest crash course ever, to provide context for their work. Also, is this working / do I even need to speak into it? Okay. Just let me know if you can't hear me. So from the 1500s until about 1918, the Ottomans ruled in Syria. It then, after World War I, fell under French colonial rule, and they were under that for about 30 years. In 1946, they gained independence from the French, and they had independence for about 20 years until there was a Ba'athist coup in the 60s, and in 1970, Hafez al-Assad took control of the country. And he's been the dictator there. He was the dictator for 30 years until the year 2000 when he died, and his son Bashar, who's the current president of Syria, took over. So Syrians have lived under 4 decades of strict authoritarian rule under the Assad family. Protesters, any political dissenters have been detained, oftentimes tortured, and people felt very unsafe and not able to speak out against the regime. Then in 2010, everything changed when in Tunisia, the Arab Spring started and spread throughout the Middle East. So as I mentioned, in Syria, many dreamed of revolution, but were too afraid to start one. But there were a group of young 15-year-old boys in Dera, a city in southern Syria, who graffitied pro-revolution slogans on buildings in their community. The regime immediately rounded them up, tortured them, they're 15-year-old boys, and then returned them to their family with clear signs of torture. And this was the breaking point for people in Dera, and they took to the streets demanding regime change. It quickly spread throughout the entire country, and the Syrian Revolution has been joined by millions of Syrians. Millions of Syrians have protested in the streets demanding peaceful change to democracy. Unfortunately, this is not what they got. The regime responded with violence and ordered the military to fire upon the citizens of the country. This was the friends and family of the people in the military, so many of them refused to, instead turned around and protected their friends and families in the protests and fired back at the regime. And this was these first defectors formed the Free Syria Army, and thousands more men would join them over the following years in response to regime violence. I want to point out the flags on the side. The top flag is the flag of the Assad family in Syria. The bottom flag was from the time of independence after French colonialism before the Assad dictatorship, and activists began waving this flag in the streets saying, this is the flag of Free Syria, we are Free Syria, and this is the flag that almost every Syrian these days uses as their flag. So some of you might be wondering, what, you just talked about Syria and you didn't even mention ISIS. That's because ISIS is actually a relatively small player in reality on the ground in Syria. They have grown in power, and it would take a very long time to discuss the causes of their rise to power, including misguided imperialism and then a failure of the international community to support the democratic movement in Syria. And I don't really have time for that today, but I'm willing to talk to you about it afterwards if you'd like. But in the last 5 years, 500,000 Syrians have been killed, and 94% of them have been killed by the regime. And this is why ISIS is not the center of the story about Syria. During the first 6 months of 2015 alone, this is a time after which ISIS has gained incredible power, and a time at which Assad actually, his power was relatively diminished before Russia started bombing and helping him in the fall of 2015. So during these 6 months, Assad still managed to kill 7 times more civilians than ISIS did. This is not what you would think if you see what we see on the news. We spend far more time talking about ISIS than we do about the regime. And so the main weapon that Assad uses are barrel bombs. These are old oil drums that are filled with shrapnel, explosives, and sometimes chemicals. They're dropped out of helicopters over schools, hospitals, markets, other highly populated areas. These bombs have been deemed illegal by the UN. It's absurd to me that the UN would say that any bomb is legal, but they must be especially bad if the UN has said that they're illegal. Assad is also starving people to death in the cities that he has under siege. He's arrested 200,000 political prisoners in 5 years since the revolution started, and he's tortured 13,000 of them, including 108 children, to death in his prisons. And he's also employed massive rape campaigns throughout the country. So yes, while ISIS is absolutely horrible, I don't know any Syrians who support them. There are very few Syrians who support them. Most of their fighters are foreign, many of them coming from Western countries. They're quite similar in mental makeup to the young white men that we have shooting up schools every year in America. And they're not your average Syrian, the people in ISIS. And many Syrians are confused why the West focuses so much on ISIS when the main killer is the regime, and there's an old saying that says the West hates fascists in beards, but it doesn't mind fascists in suits. So I want to talk a little bit about the refugee crisis. In the past year, since refugees started trying to go to Europe, we've started hearing about it in the news. However, for many years before that, refugees were fleeing to surrounding countries. As you can see, I've made a graph of the population of Syrian refugees in each country. In Europe as a continent, they have 500,000 Syrians. And in Germany, the country in Europe which has the largest number, there are 250,000 Syrians living there. And yes, that is significant, but it's not nearly as significant as the country of Jordan, which has over 500,000 just in their one small country. Lebanon, which has over 1.1 million recorded refugees living there, which means that 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. And in Turkey, where there are over 2.7 million recorded Syrians, which is just a massive number. So in places like this, where Syrians constitute a large percentage of the population, there's a very strong sense of community. I lived, ate, worked, socialized with Syrians in Gaziantep, and I actually had to go out of my way to interact with Turks when I was there. That's how strong of a presence Syrians have, and they have quite a high profile in the community as well. And for this reason, there are many Syrian organizations based there, and also for reasons of convenience and safety. It's unsafe for most activists to operate inside of Syria, so they'll base themselves in Gaziantep and travel back and forth across the border. One of the organizations that is working out of Turkey, but working mainly in Syria, is the Center for Civil Society and Democracy in Syria. and this is the organization that I had the opportunity to intern with. You can see this is a photo of some of the activists. I'm there too. And there are many more who chose not to have their photo taken because they don't want their face to be associated with this work, because most of them work under fake names. Because if they have families still inside Syria and the regime found out that they're working with this organization, their families would be detained. So this organization was started in November of 2011, very shortly after the revolution started, by 5 Syrian activists. And their mission is to support and strengthen civil society and democracy and promote values of freedom, justice, and coexistence in Syria. They now have grown to employ 70 full-time Syrian activists, all of whom were involved in the revolution in Syria. And 35 of these activists work out of the Gaziantep head office, and there are 35 others who are dispersed throughout Syria. The activists have been killed for the work that they've done. They've been killed by both the regime and by ISIS for being involved with this organization. And they also have a network of hundreds of full-time or part-time volunteers inside of Syria, and support a network of over 3,000 individual human rights defenders, peace builders, and democracy activists. And as you can see, this is an incredibly diverse organization. There are Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, Alawi, Christians, Druze, atheists, agnostics, Buddhists involved in the revolution and also in this organization. And this was truly a pluralistic revolution. The Assad regime has put a lot of effort into convincing us and convincing Syrians that it's a sectarian conflict. But if you look at the work being done on the ground by activists, you'll see it's being done by people from all different communities. The 2 co-directors of the organization are Raja, who is an Arab Christian woman, and Reynas, who is a Kurdish Muslim man. Some of the programs that they do, one of the most popular, at least in the West, is Women for the Future of Syria. This is an organization that works to build the leadership of female activists through trainings, mentoring, and networking. And so what they do is they bring female leaders from communities across Syria to Turkey. They train them in peace organizing, and then these women go back to their communities and organize other female leaders around them. And together, they form a peace circle, and then each community's peace circle decides what kind of projects they want to enact. So some women have actually, in one community, when ISIS comes in, they'll shut down schools, and they'll instead only allow education about the Quran and Hadith and other things about the Muslim faith. But these women in their community, what they did was they wrote a proposal using passages from the Quran, emphasizing the importance of education. They negotiated with ISIS, which no one does, but Syrian women can, and they opened up schools in that community. So don't underestimate the incredible work that these women are doing. And these are just your everyday civilians who are empowering each other to do this kind of work. So I don't want to only talk about Women for the Future of Syria, because there are women involved in every single one of CCSD's programs at all levels, from volunteer organizers to program director. The Aman Network, Aman means safety. This program trains peace resource experts in conflict resolution. These experts will then go to their communities, hold a town hall meeting, ask what barriers to peace exist in their community. It could be sectarian divides or leaving women out of leadership roles, things like this. They bring these concerns to local leaders, whether they be religious, military, education leaders, respected elders, tribe leaders, and to brainstorm ideas of how to resolve these issues. They bring these ideas back to the people. The people decide for their community what to want to implement. So one community that was struggling with Arab-Kurd relations, they created a Kurdish-Arabic language swap. That's just an example. And then once a year, these leaders bring their ideas together and share with Syrians in each community about what peace-building ideas worked in their communities, what challenges did they face, and they brainstorm together about national plans. The Transparency and Good Governance program focuses on training people on fighting corruption. And last but not least, the Syrian Civil Platform takes the voices of people who are involved in all of these different networks, not just the people who are full-time or part-time organizers or volunteers, but also the voice of every person that they interact with through their programs, and they try and unify those into a vision for a future of Syria that can have power in the international community and can be communicated to the UN, because Syrian civil society has been consistently left out of the peace process, and even left out of, it was like a symposium on Syria in the UK somewhere with all of these leaders, like presidents and people from governments, and they didn't invite any Syrians until the last minute, so they couldn't get visas, and one Syrian woman showed up. So we need to include Syrian voices in what's going to happen in the future of Syria. And that's what this program fights to do. So now I'm going to talk about two specific women. Okay, first I'm going to talk about her. I'm going to talk about Iman. This is not a photo of Iman because people wanted to protect their identities, so I've chosen photos from the internet, but these are real Syrian women, and the Syrian women I worked with have no less spirit than this woman. So Iman is a pharmacist. She was from a community right outside of Damascus. She was involved in protests from the beginning of the revolution. She also taught protesters first aid because the regime fired consistently upon protests and people kept going, but they needed to learn about first aid. And so she did that. She also smuggled medical supplies across regime checkpoints when they started setting up checkpoints to limit movement. And she also counseled mothers of those whose children had been killed by the regime for their participation in the revolution. She was captured and detained for 40 days for her work. When she was released, she says that she was even more committed to the revolution, and she knew, like, we need to change this. She started a campaign called We Are Your Children, Mom, where young activists could interact with and speak to mothers who had lost their children in the revolution and tell them, you are mothers of the revolution, we're children of the revolution. You're not without children, we are your children. And her own mother was arrested and interrogated by the regime because of Iman's political work. Iman was detained for a second time. This time she was tortured and humiliated, and she was only in prison for 1 week this time, but she said that it was far worse. And when she was released, she fled to Turkey, where she spent 6 months recovering, healing, and just like volunteering in a Turkish pharmacy to learn Turkish. After 6 months, she said, like, I have to get back to this work. I have to get back to fighting for the revolution. And so she joined CCSD's head office in Gaziantep, where she's now the director of the Syrian Civil Platform and works every day along with her other female co-director of that program to try and project the voice of the Syrian people to the international community. Elwan is another incredible woman that I met. She's from Zebedani, which is in southern Syria. Oh, first I want to talk about this photo real quick. So as you can see, there are some women wearing hijab, some women not wearing hijab. This is very normal in Syria. Some Muslim women will, and some will choose not to. Christians, of course, are not pressured to cover their hair. And the thing that people have over their faces, that's not for modesty, that's actually to protect against tear gas and to protect their identity. And some people do wear niqab or something that will be full covering, but it doesn't look like that. So Elwan is from Zebedani in southern Syria. Her whole family joined the protests in the very beginning. Her husband, her parents, cousins, they were all out in the streets protesting the regime and demanding change. Her father suspected that the regime might respond violently, and so he began looking for a safe place, a cabin off in the woods where they could go into hiding if that happened. Before they were able to escape safely, her husband was detained. He was captured by the regime, and she has not seen him for 4 years. And as I said before, 13,000 people have been tortured to death in Assad's prisons, and this is what she believes happened to him. So after some time, she continued her work in the revolution, and she joined the Peace Circle in Zabadani within the CCSD Women for the Future of Syria program. Their Peace Circle decided that they were going to try and negotiate a ceasefire. This is an extremely lofty goal. The UN had not managed to do it at this time, and even until this point, they've only very recently managed to negotiate such a thing. But these women, 3 years ago, said, we know our community, if anyone can do this, we can. And so in order to do this, the rebels and the regime had to decide on the same person. And now, I mean, the regime has been bombing the community, shooting at protesters, detaining and killing protesters for quite some time. And the rebels were fighting back. It wasn't an easy, it was definitely a violent conflict they were trying to solve here. And they both decided, the regime and the rebels decided that Alwan was the person that they wanted to negotiate for them. And the negotiations were set to take place in the building that was attached to the prison where her husband had been detained and probably killed. So this was obviously a very hard thing for Alwan to do. But she decided that she had to, she wasn't gonna say no. And so she went into the very building where the regime worked, and she sat down with the regime and the protesters and the rebels, and she negotiated successfully a ceasefire in Zabadani. And it only lasted for 20 days, but when you're being bombed multiple times a day, 20 days is something very significant. And she eventually had to leave Zabadani. It was no longer safe for her there. She came to Turkey, and now she works as a co-director of Women for the Future of Syria and oversees more than 25 peace circles doing similar work throughout Syria. So, I mean, when many people hear about Syria, it's in the context, like I said, of ISIS beheading people, bombed out cities, and the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. It's easy to lose hope when this is what you hear about. And it's easy to not see the power and strength of the Syrian people because it's not present in our news. But if we look beyond this and we look at what's really happening on the ground, we see thousands of instances of progress, success, and courage that should inspire hope and faith in the Syrian people. And I hope you leave today with a deeper understanding of the Syrian revolution and some stories which can help you teach others that Syrian women deserve neither our pity or our ideas about how they can free themselves. All they demand from us is respect and solidarity as they guide the way towards a democratic, peaceful future in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Rusch. I'm the Associate Director at the Center on Rights Development, and I'm so pleased to have you all here today. I'd like to introduce our moderator for the panel, Kylan Hunter. She was held up at the airport, so we're very lucky to have her today. She is currently a C Center for International Security and Diplomacy Research Fellow and a PhD student at the University of Denver at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Her research focuses on the impact of socio-political culture of women in the military and as politically violent actors. She serves on the board of Mountain to Mountain and has accompanied both the founder and film crew to Afghanistan to assist with the women's Afghan national cycling team. She spent over a decade as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. She flew the AH-1W Super Cobra attack helicopter with multiple tours in support of Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. She was the first female Cobra pilot in her squadron. Her non-flying hours include 3 years in the House of Representatives, serving as both a congressional fellow and as a congressional liaison officer. During this tour, she planned and escorted congressional delegations to 52 countries, frequently dual-heading as both escort and military liaison. Please help me in thanking her and welcoming her.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, and glad to make it here for the wonderful DIA adventure that it always is. I am very excited to introduce our two panelists for the Concealed in Conflict panel that we're about to have. We have Dr. Mandy Donahoe, who earned her doctorate here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. And she's currently dividing her time between teaching conflict resolution, human security, and women, peace, and security at the University of Denver and at the University of Colorado up in Boulder. Mandy's research focuses on the intersection of conflict and identity broadly, and focusing on women and the peace process specifically. She was a visiting research fellow at Queen's University in Belfast, where she did her fieldwork on women and community development in Northern Ireland. So please help me in welcoming Mandy to our panel. And next we have retired Army Colonel Dave Grosso. Dave is a retired colonel from the U.S. Army Special Forces and has more than 34 years of active military service. He served as an enlisted soldier and non-commissioned officer in the Army Rangers and Special Forces for 7 years. Colonel Grosso is then commissioned through the University of New Hampshire's ROTC program as an infantry officer in 1989. In addition to combat deployments to Iraq in 1991 and 2003, he served tours in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010 as the commander of a 2,000-person task force and Deputy Brigade Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division. He was the Director of Village Stability Operations for Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan and served as the Garrison Commander for Fort Carson, Colorado, acting as the Mayor and City Manager for one of the Army's largest installations in the United States. Dave provided the vision and leadership for over 1,400 civilian employees and 50 uniformed military soldiers. Dave's command consisted of 6 major directorates such as Emergency Services, Public Works, Human Resources, Training and Land Management, Child and Youth Services, Morale Welfare Programs, and numerous other activities which provided housing, recreational programs, legal support, and a full range of services for over 117,000 soldiers, family members, and retirees. We like those MWR guys too, so that's good. Dave has a Master's of Science in Leader Development and Counseling from Long Island University and was the first Army Fellow here at the University of Denver's Corbell School of International Studies in 2011. Most recently, Dave has served as the Assistant Deputy Director of the U.S. Joint Staff Special Operations and Counterterrorism Directorate, which advises the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior leaders in the Joint Staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense on employing Special Operation Forces and conducting counterterrorism, counterproliferation, combat search and rescue, detainee affairs, and sensitive DoD support to other government agencies. Please help me in welcoming Dave. We'll kick things off with presentations from each panelist, and then I will open it up to the floor for questions and discussions.
Okay. Well, first of all, I prefer if you just use Dave. That works best for me. I've been retired since basically June of last year. It's a big privilege for me to come back to Corbell and to DU, as I am the first Army Fellow that was here, and it was probably the best year of my life in many different ways. But it was a great year of enrichment for me, and I can never thank DU and faculty members such as Claude and also my fellow students that I was privileged to attend class with. So thanks to DU for that great year. Maggie, thank you for your presentation and for your service to mankind. It's a compelling life story that you've already achieved, and your service to the people of Syria is tremendous. So thank you. I'm going to give you my perspective on women in conflict based on my observations as a soldier. It's just my perspective. I'm not speaking for the military. I'm not speaking for Special Forces at this time. I mean, obviously, having served in Special Forces for 34 years has an indelible effect on the way I looked at life and certainly my work. And my personal observations are based on probably my combat deployments to Iraq in 2003, where I was in charge of a Special Forces company. Special Forces are Army Green Berets. We're the part of the Army spectrum, or Special Operations spectrum, that works in basically 12-man teams, which will soon, I guess, be 12-person teams. And we're the one part of the military that is specifically trained, educated, and chartered to work with host country nationals, indigenous people. I mean, we go back to Special Forces in Vietnam working with the Montagnards, and we generally work in either 2 persons or up to 12 soldiers deployed out into the villages, the districts, with our host nation counterparts. So we get a lot of training in cultural cross-communication. Languages, we're expected to learn at least one other language besides English. And we really truly embed with those people that we're privileged to fight alongside of. In Iraq in 2003, I led a special forces company of about 120 U.S. soldiers. I had about 450 Kurds and Free Iraqi forces that were under my command, and we were part of the initial invasion into northern Iraq in March of 2003. My soldiers, in fact, had been there earlier, much earlier, since October of 2002, while I was in the former Republic of Georgia training their military to go after terrorists in the Pankezi Gorge. So it's been, especially since 2001, it's been pretty sporty out there for the military in terms of operational deployments. My own service, I started in '81, and into '91 was basically the Cold War, and things were pretty predictable. And you trained for war, you were empowered to do certain missions. But after 1991, especially for special forces, for the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Navy, we began to see a huge rise in operational deployments overseas, where we became more in contact with women in conflict. And then, of course, my tours in Afghanistan in 2009 to 10, I had 2,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne under my command, and those paratroopers were all in 15-man groups deployed throughout western Afghanistan, from Bala Magab in the north down to the Helmand province down in the south. And they were embedded with Afghan National Police, Afghan Border Police, and sometimes Afghan National Army. So, and then as the moderator pointed out, then I was a director of village stability operations in Afghanistan from 2011 to 12. That village stability operations are where you take a 6-man special forces team or a SEAL team and embed them actually inside of the village. They stay there 24/7. Their job is to train the local villagers to protect themselves. And so obviously, though I didn't have direct observations of women in conflict during that tour, I do have a lot of lessons that, our folks have learned. And then during my portion here, I hope to cover this, what I find to be a very interesting emergence is the role of U.S. female soldiers in combat. And it's not like they just started serving in combat. They've been serving in combat for a long time. But now, as a result of the President and the Secretary of Defense's recent decision, I believe in March of 2016, all jobs within the United States military are open to female soldiers. So those will be interesting days ahead for everyone. I did some research for this. Claude taught me well. So I went to UNDP, and it said about women in conflict that according to a survey done in 2014, that women have served as active combatants in places such as Algeria, El Salvador, Mozambique, Namibia, Nepal, Nicaragua, South Africa, Sri Lanka. For some reason, they didn't include Iraq and Syria, but I put those in there because I know from firsthand knowledge and from serving on the Joint Staff that women have been serving as active combatants in those areas, among other places. That same survey pointed out that of the 55 countries that they served, they found that 38 of those 55 countries had women active in their forces, and that the women constituted between 1/10 and 1/3 of the fighting force. As far as from my personal professional observations, I've observed women specifically in Iraq in 2003, in Afghanistan in 2009 and 10, performing surveillance functions, reconnaissance, serving as couriers, smuggling of explosives and weapons, serving as interior blocking parties. In other words, when we would come into a village or a building, let's say a multi-story building, generally we would meet resistance at some point during our clearing operations, and we found that the enemy that we were fighting, whoever that was at the time, were using women as kind of a blocking force to prevent us from quickly being able to penetrate the interior of the building or the rest of the complex. And they were using our, some of the cultural and societal norms and prohibitions about men having contact with women, especially, infidels such as ourselves. I will tell you, as a soldier, I regarded everyone that I found on an objective as a combatant until they proved to me otherwise. I did not look at gender at all. I looked at their hands, and then I looked at their face, and then their body. And all I looked for is weapons, and then I began the process of target discrimination, whether this person was constituted an immediate threat to myself, or the force I was serving with, or to the I was serving with. It doesn't take a lot of strength to shoot a weapon. It takes about 2 pounds to 7 pounds, maybe 9 pounds on a rusty AK to squeeze a trigger. So as far as the capability of women in combat, we in Special Forces always regarded women as a formidable foe. And it didn't really matter to us whether they were women or if they were men. The question is were they armed? They present a threat. And those are the two discriminating characteristics that we first looked at. And then we began to develop the situation, both as individuals and as units afterwards. I don't believe in the time that I served that I ever killed a woman. I did hit one in the head with my rifle because she was coming down a hallway. It was on the 4th floor of a building in Mosul in 2003. We had fought for basically 6 hours, and the woman came screaming down the hall at me, and I happened to be the only person that was between her and the rest of my force. And I had your standard 1 to 3.5 seconds to make a decision on whether to end her life or to spare her. I don't know why I chose to do it that day, but I chose to spare her. And then maybe because she was a woman, and I say because I thought she was a woman because she was in a burqa. She was screaming at me with a high-pitched voice. And at that time, I chose to hit her in the head with my rifle and knocked her out. I don't believe, as I look back at my actions, I believe at that time I did the right thing at the right time. Under the rules of engagement that we were operating under, I had because I felt in fear for my life, and I generally thought I was threatened, that I could have used deadly force. But that day, I took the extra half a second, and I developed the situation, and I fortunately did not end that person's life, which I'm exceedingly grateful for as I begin to reflect on all of what the nation has required us to do over the last few years. I would say that initially, back in 2001, the United States military largely ignored, discounted, or underestimated the role of women in conflict. I'm not talking about U.S. soldiers right now, I'm talking about host country nationals. We basically, because we were focused on combatants, where generally combatants were men at the time, and because of the cultural, societal, religious norms that precluded us from having extensive interaction with women in Iraq or Afghanistan, we just discounted them as, combatants, and we did that eventually to our peril. We began to find, though even though how clever we thought we were, and no matter what kind of operational security that we employed, whatever measures, and we're actually very good at this stuff now after having fought for the last 15 years, that our convoys were beginning to be attacked in ways, in effective ways that we had not seen. And it generally happened, when we left by vehicle, from our base locations. And we couldn't figure out, because we started watching the surrounding areas for signs of spotters, male spotters. And you see the standard person or male with maybe a cell phone, and we'd apprehend that person, determine that generally that they were not involved. But what the one current force on the battlefield, or constant, was that there were groups of women sweeping streets outside of our base, and then outside of wherever we were going generally. Now, that didn't happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, but during the day, there was groups of women sweeping streets with generally, these brooms made out of twigs. So we started watching them, and we started collecting on them in terms of our electronic collection capabilities. And we found that they were speaking to various other combatants in the area. So to our peril, we discounted the role of women, female host country nationals in combat. So the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps began to get its act together. And in special operations, we formed what were called cultural support teams in the Army and female engagement teams for the Marine Corps. And those were with female soldiers or Marines that had been specifically selected, volunteered, screened, given some kind of assessment, some training, and that were deployed to work with either Marines that were deployed in combat down in generally Afghanistan or Iraq, and the same with their Army Special Forces, Special Operations Forces counterparts. And those women, for female Marines and soldiers, were incredible force multipliers. There were some issues. There's always, when you bring groups together like that, when you have, speaking candidly, Special Operations Forces and the Marine Corps Infantry and the Marine Special Ops have been the domain of men. And so when you inject a female soldier or Marine into that close-knit, very small group of men in an austere environment, there's going to be some norms, social norms that are challenged. And it's been interesting to watch that, and there's some interesting days ahead regarding that. We found that if we didn't use the cultural support teams or the female engagement teams, we were basically taking half the population of a village and renting it incommunicado to us. And your normal village has about 50% men, about 50% women, plus or minus 10, 20%. But if we were just going to follow the cultural and societal restrictions about men talking to women, especially in Afghanistan, then we were basically writing off 50% of the population from serving as sources of information, potential avenues of approach, rapport. We also began to use our medics. Women, I have found, have assumed many different roles in their respective societies and in their own homes and villages during periods of conflict. Often, women rise to be, even though they're already probably the de facto head of the household, they become the signatory head of the household because many men don't fight where they live. They sometimes deploy or they move within their country to fight in other locations. So by de facto, because they don't have necessarily a pay system like Western civilization militaries have, and their pay may not be regular, the women has to become the financial breadwinner for their family. We found that our medics, in treating the children of a village, were starting to get some very good information. And when we call intelligence, before it becomes intelligence, it's actually information that has to be collated and verified and assessed. So we were getting very good information just by talking to not just the children that they were treating and genuinely trying to help and fix and cure an ailment or wounds, but from a grateful mother. And we found that they were, they wouldn't probably tell us exactly where their husband, who we may have been pursuing, or their uncle, or their cousin, or brother, but they would talk about trends about what was happening and how many we had new visitors, or we've been missing, we're out of rice, or we're out of the people down the street lost all of their goats for the following reasons, and we would be able to get trends and basically some very good information from doing a good thing, which is treating the child for wounds or ailments, and from the women that were there in that village. So I talked about the cultural support teams and the female engagement teams. I had women under my command in Iraq in 2003. I had a civil affairs team of about 6 people. I didn't really have time to figure out if they were squared away. I asked the leader, who was a female staff sergeant, if she was squared away, if she knew her business. We were in the business, we were at the time fighting, a lot of Iraqis at the time, and I just didn't have time to figure out if this staff sergeant knew her job. She told me she was, she gave me her operational plan, and then I sent her out. I didn't send her out with special forces or any other security because we couldn't afford it. We had our job to do. She had her job to do. She came back to me and said, hey, Major Grasso, I really appreciate the trust. I said, well, Sergeant, I mean, you earned it. You're a staff sergeant and you're a civil affairs professional. I could tell by the way you were briefing me that you knew your business. And anyways, those soldiers are your responsibility. They're your direct supervisory responsibility. So I think there's hope for all of us in the military, even though I'm no longer part of that great institution, as we begin to explore new roles for women in the U.S. Armed Forces. I've already talked a little bit about women in conflict, how they assume new roles in conflict. They become, the heads of households, the primary wage earners. They become agents of change, where before they may not have had access because of either cultural, societal restrictions or norms. By de facto, they become, pillars and agents, visible agents of change within their own villages and districts. Okay, in closing, I'll just talk a little bit about where kind of the stats are as far as female soldiers in the military, and hopefully that will generate some discussion later. All right, so on my online research, this is about what it has been, about 203,000 females on active duty in the military, all branches of service, which constitutes about 14.5% of the active duty forces, which is right now about 1.4 million in the United States military. Interestingly, 7.1% of the admirals and generals in all of our armed services are female. About 69 out of 976 general officers and admirals. Women have been serving in combat, as you probably all know, and as many of us have experienced, at least since Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, but before that also. What's changed about warfare a little bit in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the kind of the construct where we had in the Cold War, where there was going to be, the enemy comes from this way and we're going this way, so behind this way is all friendly forces, and that's where basically the support functions where generally women were assigned to. They were generally safe. I mean, they might get bombed, they might get mortared, they might get artillery fire, but they were not going to be involved in direct combat. And there has been some exclusions or congressional restrictions on women serving in combat. But women have been serving in combat during my lifetime in Iraq and Afghanistan. 67 women have been killed in Iraq, 600 wounded in action. 33 women killed in action in Afghanistan, 300 wounded in action. And this is, according, I didn't get this from the official Army stats, but that sounds about right. There's probably more, unfortunately, who have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since this survey was taken. The new policy announced earlier this spring by the Secretary of Defense opens all positions in the military to women. So that opens up about 220,000 positions that were previously precluded from having women serve in specifically the areas of the infantry, the armor, reconnaissance, and special operations. I'll save what I think should happen regarding that integration to the questions if they do come up. Thank you.
I teach a class here to the undergrads on Women, War, and Peace, and so to be introduced to this core symposium on the intersection of gender and conflict is really such a welcome sight. So I'm just thrilled to be included in it, to be a part of what I think is such an interesting and important topic. My fieldwork for my book project focused on women's contributions to community development in Northern Ireland, and I called that community development peace building. In collecting those stories, I also collected a really wide range of stories of women actively engaging in conflict. And so rather than speaking to the foundation of my work on community development, I'd rather just share a couple of stories that answer or that speak to the common themes already that Maggie and Dave have brought up in terms of women as breadwinners, women's engagement, and women standing together in solidarity, which is such an important issue. But as Maggie started a crash course, super quick, on Northern Ireland, the troubles